We have titled this session Knitting a New Era of Partnerships, and that really is the crux of what we are discussing in this session, but also at the Jakarta Futures Forum. Around the world, many new partnerships and alliances are being spun, and much of it is happening here in the Indo-Pacific region. This, of course, has taken place in the context of geopolitical flux at a time when multilateralism has fallen prey to a crisis of disequilibrium, a mismatch between the scale of global challenges and the capacity of existing international systems to address those challenges. This disequilibrium has left a gap in the international order, and the gap is being filled by new alliances. These alliances of minilaterals and plurilaterals, call them coalitions of the willing, flexible groupings, or fluid alignments, are increasingly defining the emerging world order. There are certain advantages that these alliances have. They're agile and efficient, and they get the work done compared to the unwieldy and time-consuming processes of multilateralism. But there are very relevant questions. What are the possible consequences of the rise of these new coalitions? Can they provide effective solutions to the problems that multilateralism has failed to solve? And will they replace existing alliances and institutions, or would it be better for them to work in complementarity? And we have a stellar panel here. We have about 50 minutes for this discussion, and we're going to dive right in. Ashok, let me start with you. You have written an essay in the Jakarta edit about parallel globalizations, and I was actually fascinated to read it. But what we're also seeing are parallel diplomacies take place around the world. And as you see this unfold, what do you think are the associated risks of this fragmenting and parallel diplomacies taking place? And also, how do you think these coalitions and alliances could actually evolve?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sunena. And I must begin by thanking ORF and CSIS for inviting me to this wonderful city. And I must acknowledge Ambassador Sandeep Chakrabarti, a friend of many of us in Delhi. We miss you a lot in Delhi, Ambassador. We want you to spend a lot of time in Jakarta, but we do miss you in Delhi. Sunena, you've framed a plethora of issues before us today, and I don't think we can do justice to it in 5 hours, let alone 50 minutes, but let me begin with in my 5 minutes. If you look at the multilateral institutional architecture in the world today, it essentially still goes back to what was set up for broadly the Europe or the Europe-Atlantic region in the 1940s, or maybe between the two world wars and after the Second World War, with some additions after the Cold War. Now, much of that was germane for a particular geography and a particular time. Today, the challenges and the opportunities are in the Indo-Pacific, where this is where the economies of the future are being shaped. This is where the economies of today are being shaped. This is where the security challenges of the 21st century are being argued out. And the whole notion of security has changed from just gunboats and planes, fighter planes, so all of that is still there, to supply chain security, technology, health, ecology, and climate change. And all of that is being played out here. Many of the institutions that we have inherited from the Second World War or the Cold War era are not just geographically irrelevant to this region, they're also thematically irrelevant to our world. Therefore, you are seeing a variety of coalitions, partnerships, agile groupings, minilaterals, plurilaterals, institution building, which is still at a very early stage in this part of the world. We have an alphabet soup of acronyms and abbreviations. I suspect we will have many more. And what is not helping, of course, is that we are all caught in the midst of two great powers and their changing postures in this part of the world. Quite apart from the economic scale of the Indo-Pacific, there is the quantum of the rise of China. Forget China's politics, that's a separate issue, we may have different views on that, but the sheer scale and significance and quantum of China's rise is causing changes in our world. Second, there's a changing posture in the US. Again, where that will finally land, how consistent that change will be is another matter. We may have different views on that, but that again is posing challenges. Uh, all of us, in a sense, if you look at trade and the economy, which you mentioned, uh, are grappling with two challenges. One, in terms of supply chains, we all want a China plus one strategy. Two, in terms of markets, we all want an America plus one strategy. And in a sense, we are looking for diversification, sustainable diversification. And all of us in this room, in this region, are part of each other's diversification story.
Okay. So you talked about how we are looking at greater contestation in the Indo-Pacific. Lisa, that brings me to you. Give us the view from Australia, which of course has been very nimble in joining these alliances like the AUKUS and the QUAD. When you think of the Indo-Pacific region as a whole, how do you think these alliances and coalitions could be used to safeguard the sovereignty and the strategic autonomy of the region?
Thank you so much, Sunaina. And can I also start, as the shock did, by thanking ORF and CSIS for welcoming me here, and also Ambassador Chakravorty for your very colourful address in The Two Husbands. I'm not sure which one I'd prefer to be married to, but I don't mind watching football, so we'll leave it at that. I did just want to say that this is a really important conversation for me to be participating in today, because the Australia-India Institute just held a trilateral maritime security dialogue of Australia, Indonesia and India in Canberra, and very much focused on some of the issues that we'll cover over the next day when we look at issues of shared interoperability, maritime security, maritime domain awareness, environmental protections, all of the sorts of things that are facing all our three countries in this region. But to go to your question, Sunaina, I think, how can these alliances sort of safeguard sovereignty and, provide that accountability, I think, that the region is looking for? I think to really answer that, you have to recognise the importance that these sorts of alliances need to really be able to deliver. And they need to be able to deliver on timely outcomes that the region wants to see. Because the reason that a lot of them have come about in the first place is from the fact that the larger, the broader multilateral institutions have not delivered in a timely, focused, policy-oriented manner. So therein lies the reason why we're debating this today, and why we're hoping that this is a new sort of reset of global cooperation through these smaller coalitions. So that first is their challenge. Secondly, though, I think we do need to be mindful that this is not about replacing multilateral institutions. It should be about enhancing, it should be about resetting the purpose of multilateral institutions by having a more policy-focused agenda, a more timely agenda for some of these sorts of groupings. So to give an example, of course, I will talk about a little bit about the QUAD. We all know that the QUAD has a number of really important working groups. Now, those working groups, haven't just sort of come out of nowhere. They are the sorts of policy areas that the Indo-Pacific region needs addressing, be it climate change and disaster resilience, be it critical and emerging technologies, be it cybersecurity, be it health security and pandemic preparedness. They are all policy-focused areas that is at the forefront of this region. Now, in terms of outcomes, which is what really needs to happen if we're going to take, the future of these sorts of groupings more seriously, I think the QUAD has delivered in some way in that space. If we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, the QUAD committed to over 1 billion vaccine doses to be delivered in this region through a coordinated effort of the United States providing the finance, India providing the manufacturing, and Japan and Australia providing the logistics and the delivery. That is a really important outcome. More recently, that same Quad Health Security Working Group convened a pandemic preparedness strategy. Again, looking at how it can support the region in the effort that something may emerge again, to ensure that the region has emergency frameworks, regional resilience in place. So, therein lies one good example. However, I would say right at this point in time, the future of the Quad is uncertain. We know that, President Trump has not made it very clear whether or not he is committed to these sorts of groupings. He's certainly not committed to multilateralism, but whether or not he wants to see the US remain in the Quad and committed to some of these public goods that the Quad is about remains to be seen. At the same time, what we've seen overnight, particularly with the threat of an increase in tariffs on India from the 25% that's already there to something greater, may mean that India doesn't want to host the United States president in India later this year for the Quad Leaders Summit. So all of that really puts the future of a really important grouping for this region in jeopardy. Therein lies the question is, well, if the US was to, retreat from the Quad, should there be another country in this region that should step up and fill that fourth country spot? Would Indonesia be a country that would consider being the fourth country of the Quad? And I think that is a conversation at this particular forum we should consider in light of the current global shift that we're living in.
All right. That actually brings us right to Philip's and to the question that Lisa has posed about Quad. So please do respond to that. And also, if you can tell us, the question of the Global South, countries are hedging their bets. Of course, countries of the Global South were long left out of the international system, and countries like India and Indonesia are building alliances across different blocs. Do you think that strategy is an effective strategy for the Global South, or do we need a different approach?
Thank you. I thought the question of Global South would prevent me from commenting on very sensitive security type of questions, but I'll deal with that later. First, I'd like to as well thank ORF and CSIS for inviting me to share some thought in this conversation. I'm aware of many hats. Now with the Presidential Communication Office, I'm also Senior Fellow at CSIS. Number one, whether or not this new coalition of the Global South is an effective way in tackling the problem in this uncertain world, I don't know. But one thing that we know is that because the US has been moving away from various commitments into multilateralism, and then from the UN and from climate agreement and so on and so forth, that then all countries, especially in the Global South, must keep all the options open. And that's why I think many initiatives, including Indonesia, that has been done by the president so far, we are trying to look into more alternative. I've been having many conversations with colleagues in Indonesia, at CSIS and the foreign ministry and so on. I think, for example, for Indonesia, we've been placing too much attention when we're talking about Indo-Pacific, too much attention to the Pacific part. And we are kind of neglecting the Indo part, where Indonesia, I think, should play a bigger role. And then for Indonesia, in the context of looking for alternatives, while keeping the existing one remaining, then the Global South makes more sense to Indonesia right now to forge more deeper cooperation, for example. Somehow, Global South is a contested term, and then it's a very generic term, but for the purpose of discussion tonight, I think we agree that Global South refer to the developing world. And then before Trump, I think we tend to look at the global south or international relations more in the sense through the security lens. Now, global south being a developing world, our main attention is development. And we are trying so hard not to be defined by the geopolitical tension between US and China, for example, and so on, because we have our momentum. I don't really think that the US is in decline, but I agree more with Farid Zakaria, for example, who said that rather the others are catching up. And I think that's a very relevant view. The US remain the most powerful militarily and so on. But then we, Indonesia and others, now are catching up. Number three, regardless though, when we are talking about Global South, in the context of this Trump era, the problem for to be a more effective coalition, not alliance, it's a sensitive term in Indonesia, alliance, leadership matters. And I think our problem in the Global South right now is almost no country is ready to step up and then to fill in the leadership role in finding solutions to pressing issues in terms of, for example, the traditional issue of war and so on. China is not really taking that role. India, I think, is calculating as well, selecting selective engagement in some conflicts. Indonesia, of course, we do not really have the capacity as yet to be able to forge a solution to many global problems. But leadership matters, and then I think the other side of the coin of Trump being in the White House is that our leaders are forced to talk into one another, and then that's why we've seen a lot of conversation taking place between leaders of the Global South, and I think that is a good modality. So for the question of Quad, we are not into alliance so far. But then the president, there was an interesting, I think, interview or statement by the president somehow, I think before or right after he was sworn in. And then what he said about Quad and AUKUS and so on, what he said was, we understand the reason why it was formed. So he understand, Indonesia understand why AUKUS and Quad are there. So his mindset is not, Indonesia is not opposed to this arrangement, security arrangement, but for Indonesia to be able to participate in any of this alliance will take a longer time, because domestically it's something that people would have a very intensive discussion on.
Right. That is your answer, Lisa. Sindarpal, many of these alliances, coalitions have emerged in response to China's assertiveness and expansionist approach in the region. And many of them also have emerged in the context of reinforcing and complementing existing US alliances. Of course, that is something that we are now questioning even in this session. But overall, how effective would you say they have been in managing strategic competition and also countering China's approach?
Thank you, Sunaina. I also want to thank ORF, CSIS, for organizing this. RSIS and ORF had a workshop earlier today, so I look forward to more interaction between the Rajaratnam School and our partners, CSIS and also ORF. Now, thanks for saving the easy question for me. I think just follow on from what Lisa said and what Philip said as well. The way to answer your question depends on what vantage point you start from, right? And I think, come from Southeast Asia, you come from an ASEAN state. Like Philip said, the broad consensus is we understand why QUAD was formed. We understand why AUKUS was formed. Asia has gone through a slight change perception of AUKUS, for example, the rest of the ASEAN countries, then how effective has been, I think I go back to what Lisa was saying. I think the QUAD suffers from, so it's easy to be a critic of ASEAN, I'll come to that later, second round. It's easy to be a critic of ASEAN. But when you look at the QUAD, I think, like Lisa said, the first problem is about whether US leadership is going to be there for the QUAD, because I guess that's supposedly the building block of the QUAD. Number two, there were earlier problems already when Trump came to power, because some people said that the QUAD will be something that, the only one thing that Trump will embrace, because Trump 1.0 led to QUAD 2.0, right? The problem, of course, is, as Lisa was pointing out, some countries in the QUAD don't want to securitize the QUAD. I think India being one example, Australia to some extent. While I guess the current American view about the QUAD is it needs to become more or less a security organization. And I think until and unless the QUAD among themselves resolve what the QUAD wants to be, I don't see how they can carry out what they think they want to do. The priorities are not clear. I don't see how you can carry out a goal because the goal isn't clear. And I think, again, I echo what Philip said, and I go a bit further. For Southeast Asian states, a varied balance of power in the region is a good thing. You don't have to take part in it. If other people are doing it for you, it's not a bad thing. So therefore, AUKUS is not necessarily a bad thing. QUAD may not have to be a bad thing. Because other people do the heavy lifting for you, that's fine. It's a varied balance of power, more powers in the region, multipolarity in the region. No one power can dominate. No one power can coerce you to do something. That's a good thing. Thank you.
Right. I'm going to come back to the ASEAN question, of course. But Ashok, first, the question of how we can make these coalitions more effective and to deliver more. Do you think there are ways for the AUKUS, the QUAD, the IPEF, the ASEAN Plus to be working together? And what areas would that be? Would you look at trade?
IPEF is more or less dead. Whether IPEF was ever alive is a moot question. AUKUS, there is a question mark over US commitments to AUKUS. I guess those commitments will exist, but at a price point which will be very different from what was initially offered. And frankly, whether US supply chains can make good their promises to Australia is another matter. And QUAD is also a big question mark. The point is, with the changed US posture, all of the coalitions, partnerships, agile groupings that the US helped create or co-create in this part of the world will need to move forward and with like-minded partners working together, with India and Australia working together, with India, Australia, and Indonesia working together, with Singapore and India working together, and so on. But the key is the quantum and consistency of US retrenchment, and there is going to be some, is considerable. Even our collective efforts cannot entirely fill that. We need to recognize that. So plan B will always be a plan B. In some senses, the gap the US is leaving behind cannot be filled by all of us together, whether it's in terms of security provision, whether it's in terms of international public goods, whether it's in terms of the market sink or the consumption sink that America, or demand sink that America is. So this is a challenge we're all facing. But I do believe that this amorphous nature of institution and coalition building will continue for some time. I don't think anyone wants to be fixated on hard definitions, or, as was pointed out, on the securitization of QUAD. Even many of the QUAD members are not certain where that will go. And as for replacing the US or replacing any country in QUAD, I don't think that's on the table at all. QUAD was always seen as a set of principles which you could evangelize with other partners. So India and Australia working with Indonesia is an evangelization of QUAD principles. It doesn't mean a change in the architecture of QUAD.
Right. Lisa, when we talk about smaller groups of countries coming together. In a way, we're also seeing decision-making shifting to more exclusive clubs. And that does bring us to the bigger, larger question here, which is about the smaller and less powerful countries and the voice that they have in decision-making. How can these coalitions potentially work with developing countries, smaller island states, countries that are just more vulnerable to multiple crises, to ensure that they have a voice and are not left out?
Thanks, Ananya. I mean, I think, coming from Australia, obviously we see the Pacific, particularly the South Pacific, as our vuvale, which it means family. So we have a very strong vuvale partnership. It is something where these small island states, which are obviously having a climate crisis, is very much front and centre of foreign policy, development policy. But more broadly, when you talk about some of these issues, like Ashok just touched on with the future of groupings and whether they'll survive, and then what does that mean for smaller countries or for the global south? I mean, I really think that this is where a level of flexibility in the model needs to remain. And I think this is where the Indo-Pacific is perfectly placed to welcome and be embracing these sorts of groupings, because in nature, this is a region made up of a lot of diversity in itself. So, that diversity, that decentralized sort of power structure that the region already is, means there should be the opportunity for, whether it's the QUAD or ASEAN or BIMSTEC or any of those sorts of groupings, to change in nature. The flexibility should be there for us to accommodate it. On AUKUS, obviously the difference with AUKUS is that it is very much a security pact. But both QUAD and AUKUS operate under the same principle of a free and open Indo-Pacific region. AUKUS, though, again, same issue as the QUAD, in that the future of the United States' commitment to AUKUS is unclear. So just recently, both Australia and the UK signed a 50-year treaty, a bilateral treaty for the future of that can continue in terms of knowledge sharing, information sharing, a security pact in that sense. Now, what's important, I think, in that sort of arrangement is it's being flexible to the fact that we have, a major power that is just not making it clear what the future looks like in terms of being part of that sort of grouping. But I think in any sort of flexible changed model, be it the QUAD or AUKUS or any of the ones that we're talking about here, there does need to be consideration back, which is to the importance of those that are not a part of those groupings, or at least even if they don't get the opportunity to have their voice heard, are heard through those that are the more powerful. And that's going to be a condition that we're going to need to monitor, in the hope that, there is some accountability in terms of these sorts of flexible arrangements as we go forward.
Right. Phillips, the question of how it might be easier perhaps to question ASEAN and its weaknesses. But when we think of regional groupings, and that does bring us to the point of how we do need multilateralism, and we cannot be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we need to strengthen multilateralism while we work with newer coalitions and groupings. When we think of ASEAN or even BIMSTEC, how do you think they can regain relevance and work in complementarity with these coalitions?
ASEAN has a lot of rethinking that needs to be done because I think in the past 5-10 years, there are problems that ASEAN could not solve that affecting the credibility of ASEAN as a regional institution. But I think Southeast Asia has been better off with ASEAN rather than without ASEAN. So that's, I think, the option that we have right now, and then we need to strengthen ASEAN and then keep actually the dialogue partners, the major powers who are engaging with the region and so on to remain true to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, for example, and then seeing the region as a platform for cooperation, because when ASEAN was set up back in the 1967, it was transforming conflict into cooperation. And then that's, I think, the DNA of ASEAN. And I agree earlier with Mr. Singh, who was saying that it's easy to criticize ASEAN. But when we are looking at other regional organizations, I think we should be happy with what we have, because in the time of crisis, during the pandemic, for example, ASEAN, I think, works pretty well. Of course, with the help of the dialogue partners, but in a way, it's actually working out the existing mechanism within ASEAN. So that's, I think, what we can learn from ASEAN. Number two, if we link this with the question of the Global South, I made a point earlier that leadership matters. And if I can give you one example, again, during the pandemic, and this is why I think sometimes now we realize we place too much emphasis on viewing things from security lens. But when it comes to functional cooperation, like pandemic, or tackling the problem of development and so on and so forth, there are a lot that have been done by members of ASEAN together, as well as with other regional organizations. And leadership, as I made the point earlier, during the pandemic in the G20, right, Indonesia, during the chairmanship of Indonesia, the developing world representative of the G20, Indonesia, South Africa, as well as India. But during the chairmanship of Indonesia, and then the three countries, more or less, were instrumental in pushing for the establishment of what we now know as the pandemic funds that help the developing world, in terms of providing vaccines, and even it has worked well beyond the period of pandemic. It's still, the pandemic funds is still now functions, right? Just recently, they've been deciding to provide vaccines to Africa in terms of monkeypox and so on, to Nigeria, and then to other countries. And these, I think, the example of how Global South representative in multilateral institution where the global north is there is very important. And we can shift, in my view, if we are making a true coalition, if you keep referring to coalition, then actually the development agenda of the Global South can be pushed through. And then we are trying to remind the big powers and so on that we do have in the Global South. We do have our development interests that we want to keep this momentum going. And then, of course, we are not avoiding security and other strategic issues. But if we are looking back to the origins of why we have ASEAN and so on and so forth, we do want to bring development to the people. And for that, we do need a more peaceful and stable region, which ASEAN, in my view, has been successful in doing in Southeast Asia, in the Southeast Asia region.
Right. And you will have the last word on that, Sindhapal. Do you agree with what he says? And if you were also to widen that and look at BIMSTEC and these regional organizations working with the emerging coalitions. I should also say that we will be opening this up to the audience very soon, so do keep your questions ready.
I try to keep this short. It's hard to disagree with Philip, even he's sitting next to me. So I think the first thing, when you talk about BIMSTEC, I think if you look at BIMSTEC, I mean, a lot of people have a very romantic notion of BIMSTEC because it's one of those organizations where you have South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries together. But over the years, again, I think there's been some confusion about what exactly BIMSTEC is. The name suggests technical cooperation in the economic realm. At one point, I think it was India which wanted to make it a bit more working in certain domains of security, for example. Not, not military exercises per se, but maybe HDR and other stuff. So over the years, I think BIMSTEC has also, the clarity in BIMSTEC has been a problem. How, I will just quickly talk about the second part of your question about ASEAN and how ASEAN deals with things. I think one thing that when you look around, you read around, people talk about ASEAN and say, oh, it doesn't change, it doesn't adapt. I think I disagree. I give you one example. When this term Indo-Pacific was floated around, ASEAN countries won't touch it with a 10-foot pole, right? Because pregnant within that term were certain meanings, which ASEAN countries didn't want to be associated with. And we all know what those meanings were. But over time, I think ASEAN realized you cannot escape the term. So ASEAN wanted to wish it away, can't wish it away, and the AOIP then comes out. And ASEAN's achievement has been that China has supported and endorsed ASEAN's AOIP. The only Indo-Pacific statement I think China has endorsed. So over time, ASEAN has been able to be nimble. ASEAN has been able to move. Now, how it deals with other organizations, I think again, ASEAN GCC meeting, I think just took place this year or last year, right? So again, another way for which ASEAN to interact with other regional organizations. So I think in that sense, ASEAN scorecard is not too bad. I agree with Philip. There are some changes that need to happen. The Myanmar situation is not exactly giving ASEAN, not ASEAN's crowning moment, a glory moment. I think what happened recently between Thailand and Cambodia again. But I think ASEAN has moved, maybe it needs to move faster, engaging other institutions. I also think just the last point, and I'm going to be a bit controversial here. We sometimes, they say, if you play team sport, they say, don't only watch the ball, watch the player as well. We keep watching ASEAN, but individual ASEAN countries do a lot of different things outside ASEAN. And I think that's important to look at. For example, I seriously believe that over time, if the QUAD becomes what Lisa was talking about as a provider of public good in the Indo-Pacific, individual ASEAN countries may not mind in certain domain, certain issues, to take part in certain, activities that are led by the QUAD, right? Because that shows the nimbleness of ASEAN members. Not everybody has to agree, but one or two might join. They don't have to commit to a 10-year program. You're going to do something, you can join. So again, I think watching ASEAN as an organization, watching individual Southeast Asian countries are two different. Thank you.
Thank you. We have floating mics in the room. Please raise your hand and we're going to take some questions from the audience. Do introduce yourself and keep the questions as brief as possible. So we'll take one in that part of the room. One over there in the middle. And the third in the third corner.
Hi, thank you so much for such an interesting session. My name is Julia Roknefard. I'm from Malaysia. I'm an academic. I wanted to pick up where Dr. Sinderpal just left off and to pose my question to Mr. Phillips Vermont. In fact, thinking about ASEAN itself, yes, we need to watch the players, what the individual players within ASEAN are doing. But we also need to watch what's happening within ASEAN itself. We recently had Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim as a chairman of ASEAN negotiating the peace deal between Thailand and Cambodia, although that was also propped up by the external players, which are the United States and China, which were sitting there at the table. So my question is coming from observations of ASEAN and this particular deal, which looks more like it happened due to the external pressures or some kind of external influence, and maybe with a little bit of luck that Prime Minister Anwar is having right now as the chairman of ASEAN. Is ASEAN ready to introduce some stronger mechanisms within itself for conflict resolution, to address issues like Myanmar, for example, because we've been grappling with it for so long and nothing is happening? To address issues like Thai Cambodia, dispute and others to also prevent the intervention of not cooperation, but intervention in the affairs of internal ASEAN affairs of external players.
Right.
Thank you.
We got that question. Yes. In that part of the room?
Yeah.
We have a hand there, Abhishek. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Ken Jimbo from Japan. I was actually going to ask exactly the same question to Mr. Phyllis Belmonte about the recent Thai-Cambodia border dispute has escalated much more than that we expected. And then that arbitration took place with the initiative of the Prime Minister Anwar. But as just mentioned, that it has been, I think, backdrop by the stronger influence by United States and China over influencing the issue. So, listening to Prime Minister Anwar's last speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, I sense that he doesn't want to put all kind of issue in the basket under the US-China strategic competitions. And ASEAN has its own autonomous role to play in calibrating those kind of dispute settlement mechanisms. So I wonder why that those two representatives from US and China need to sit down at the table in dealing with that situation. And I really wonder what kind of like a structure that ASEAN leaders would like to play out in those settlement issues.
We're going to take one more question. Yes. Room.
Good evening. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Him Desmay, Executive Director of the Cambodian Center for Regional Study. Thank you, CSS Indonesia, and thank you, ORF, for inviting me here. As a Cambodian, I just want to express my deep thanks to the US, to China, to ASEAN for helping make sure that there is a ceasefire to help mediate. Now it's time to also make sure the ceasefire hold. So,
but do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a short question as well. So that the opening. So since there are a lot of interest on Cambodia-Thailand border conflicts, first one is how what ASEAN should do to enhance its dispute, peaceful dispute settlement mechanism. That's my first question. Second one, as all the distinguished speaker mentioned, ASEAN process happened in part as a result of inflection point. For example, it happened in 1967, then the Cold War, and then after the Cold War. Do you anticipate the next inflection point, and where do you see ASEAN go in that direction?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think those questions were first directed to you.
Thank you. On the case of Cambodia and Thailand, we are a peace activist. We wouldn't mind whoever involved in the negotiation as long as the conflict settled. I think that's my first response to the question. So whether the US representative or the Chinese representative were sitting behind Prime Minister Anwar as well as the representative of Cambodia and Thailand, the optics might maybe we read too much on the optics that happened, but I think what was happening, I couldn't read Prime Minister Anwar's. You are asking about why the two representatives were there. I couldn't speak on behalf of Prime Minister Anwar for sure. But I think the pretext was ASEAN could not afford another conflict happening in the region with what we are experiencing with Myanmar. And then if Cambodia and Thailand were continuing clashing in the borders and so on, it would, I think, jeopardize the whole situation in Southeast Asia. That's, I think, my basic response. But it's not new as well for ASEAN to have external power involved in peace settlement. If you remember during the Indo-China War, there was Jakarta Informal Meeting in Indonesia where we brought together parties of conflicts. But then it was continued in Paris. And then that was with the help of France and so on and so forth. And eventually we settled the problem in Indochina, and eventually the two countries, few countries of the mainland Southeast Asia, then became a member of ASEAN. So the DNA is really trying to transform conflicts into a cooperation. And as long as ASEAN is in the driver's seats, so the way I read that optics was Prime Minister Anwar was in the driver's seat in the whole conversation. So I wouldn't read too much on whether or not it's because the Chinese or the Americans, but the fact that Prime Minister Anwar took the initiative, he talked to the two countries, and then they eventually agreed for peace settlement.
Okay, since we have a couple of minutes still to go, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to come in and perhaps respond to the questions or also offer us your closing thoughts. Let's start with you.
Thank you. As a representative of a non-ASEAN country, I think I have a view on the ASEAN question. Is this an inflection point for ASEAN? A few thoughts. One, in South Asia, in the subcontinent, we have nothing but admiration for ASEAN. It is the grouping we could never have in our part of the world. It's enormously successful. Having said that, it is at an inflection point. We've talked about multilateralism, we've talked about multipolarity. We haven't talked sufficiently about multicentrism. What do I mean by that? We all talk about the centrality of ASEAN and of ASEAN-centric Indo-Pacific architecture. ASEAN is a center. It is not the center. This region is too diverse, it has too many sub-regional and thematic diversities to have just one center. It will need multiple centers. Our challenges are too large. Second, coming specifically to trade, we must recognize what President Trump has done. He has legitimized differential deal-making in trade. Not everyone likes that. If you are at the receiving end, you don't like it. But a lot of people sense opportunity. And therefore, this will come into the way other countries, partner countries, want to do trade arrangements with ASEAN. I don't think ASEAN is quite ready for that. But it is a challenge which is out there.
Lisa.
I think I'd just like to reiterate the importance of the future of ASEAN remaining strong in the region. It is, a member organisation of Southeast Asian countries that Australia looks at as wanting to engage with as ASEAN itself. Like Ambassador mentioned, Australia also has an ambassador ASEAN here in Indonesia. That shows the importance of how we see the relationship with ASEAN. There's a lot of policy ideation that goes on in terms of Australia's engagement with ASEAN, and it's all around those sorts of shared norms around peace, stability in the region. I just wanted to end up by talking back about the issue of these groupings not duplicating efforts. I think there is a bit of that going on. And I think a way forward is to have more coordination. ASEAN, I know, has done that with BIMSTEC recently, looking at that sort of workshops on the blue economy and disaster resilience, those sorts of things. Coming together as groupings on shared policy issues is a way to end duplication. It's a way to also strengthen groupings, together in that sense, and should be looked at more into the future rather than, groupings being fragmented against each other.
The last word is yours.
I just come in on my Cambodian friend's question about inflection point. I think if you look at the Thai-Cambodia situation and the Myanmar situation, I think most people will agree that it came out of domestic fragility. Right? Domestic fragility within Southeast Asian states have led to these two crises. And I think it's a bit unfair to try to anticipate or stop domestic fragility within an ASEAN state. Right? So therefore, I think it's very hard to firstly predict these things. And number two, given the character of ASEAN to interfere in domestic politics of this country. Right? I will go a bit further. I think for me, if you want to talk about the inflection point, I think it will be an open military conflict between the US and China. But that will be an inflection point. Because that will be a worst case scenario, because the worry is not choosing sides at that juncture might become harder and harder to do. And I think that is the worry, and I think that is the inflection point, not this conflict, not the Myanmar crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been an invigorating discussion, and we couldn't have asked for a better start to the Jakarta Futures Forum. A big round of applause for our speakers.